Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the reading of the fic entitled Fellow Feeling. Here's the summary. Shouta had planned the off-campus patrols to be a safe and reliable method of building trust between students, and a way to crack his two problem children open and figure out what makes them so incredibly determined to oppose each other at every turn. He just hadn't planned cracking them open to be literal. Or Shouta goes digging into Midoriya and Bakugou's past, and a collapsing building and a villain with a fear quirk gives him more than he bargained for. This fic is over 50,000 words with 9 chapters. Here's Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Enter. Problem Children. Shouta has known from the beginning that he's not cut out to be a teacher. He's not a particularly nurturing person. He's coarse, harsh, abrasive. Some have even called him downright mean. He's quick to judge and slow to forgive, and very quick to expel. He's strict to a fault. Being sociable makes him tired. Being anything makes him tired. In short, all the worst qualities for a teacher to have, he has them. Has them in droves. Teaching hadn't been his first choice of career, to put it nicely. His first choice had been to become an underground hero, which he accomplished. He'd even made it 7 whole years before he finally reached his limit, which is further than most people ever get, because being an underground hero is something akin to being a soldier in the trenches, cold and desperate and filthy, and unequivocally earth-shattering. He's known more than one newbie to leave the game entirely after their first mission, unable to stomach the reality of operating where other heroes wouldn't dare tread, because underground heroes aren't like the flashy, smiling mainstream heroes that all the news outlets love. Being an underground hero means sweat and blood and loss, means choking down your fears so you can handle all the grimy missions that the spotlight heroes could never stomach. Not without losing their precious reputations, at least. Well, Shouta doesn't have a reputation to protect. Or, he didn't. He'd spent 7 years in those trenches, and eventually even among the underground heroes, he'd become something of a talking point. Very few have made it as far as he has. Shouta can handle what most other heroes would balk at the mere thought of. Until the day that he can't. There's no singular event that drives him away, no singular death, or mission, or loss. It's just, one day he wakes up, bastard curled on his chest and purring as if he's at least 7 pounds lighter than he actually is, and it's over. It's just over. He tries to hand in his resignation, but he doesn't make it all the way to the agency he's currently operating out of. Instead, he's stopped by this fuzzy, white rat, he thinks, who plucks the letter of resignation out of his hand and looks at it like it's personally offended him, and offers him a job instead. Teaching at UA. He takes it. It's objectively a terrible decision. He's going to be an awful teacher. He knows it from the moment he signs his employment forms. He's always been harsh, and his time as an underground hero has probably made him downright callous. He's in no position to take care of a class of 20 snot-nosed teenagers. He's hardly in a position to take care of himself. But the rat, Nezu, he learns, who replaced the principal that had overseen Shouta's years at UA, doesn't seem concerned. He forces him to go to school-mandated counseling, and between that and Hisashi's incessantly positive needling, he pulls himself together. And it's refreshing, almost. Teaching, he means. It's so different from anything else he's ever done. Not always in a positive way, but still. He learns that teaching isn't what he thought it would be. That hero course students can actually use a bit of harshness, a bit of abrasion. And by the end of his first year, he's taken to teaching with more aptitude than he'd ever thought possible. Nezu gives him knowing glances in the staff room, and he stoically vows never to tell him that he'd been right. Though, he still has his limits. 1 year he expels an entire class of first years, then chews out the judges of the entrance exam for good measure. It may seem heartless, but he's seen the worst of what the world has to offer, and he has no intention of standing by as an entire class of heroes get themselves chewed up and spit out due to their ineptitude. Some people just aren't cut out to be heroes, and he's not going to be their instrument of suicide. He's done letting people die. The whole situation earns him a few dings on his permanent record, but it's not like it matters. He has no plans to leave UA anytime soon, and there's very little he could do that would make Nezu fire him. So he falls into a routine. He still has nightmares sometimes, still has the occasional flashback to his time in the underground. but those days fall further and further behind him as he throws himself into his work. He gains a reputation for being strict, but that's fine. As long as his students actually stand a chance at surviving their first missions as pro-heroes, they can call him whatever they want. Except, then Class 1A happens. Well, Class 1A happens every year, technically, but this particular class is deserving, in Shota's opinion, of being labeled the Class 1A, with a capital and everything. Because after this year, he's never going to be able to hear those words without immediately seeing a host of rowdy, trouble magnet children who have come into their roles as heroes too soon. He knows something is different about this particular class from day one. He isn't expecting anything to be different. He looks over their test results and quirk assessment forms with a tired, apathetic eye, cataloging their abilities and considering whether or not they'll be good fits for hero work. Some of them are an obvious shoe-in, the two that had been admitted based on recommendation, of course, and he sees a lot of potential in this Bakugo too. Others are a bit more questionable. Sato's scores on the written exam are paltry. Aoyama's quirk has such a ridiculously short usage time that he'd be useless in a drawn-out fight. Though Kaminari had scored high in the practical, he seems like, well, a bit of an idiot. And then there's Midoriya. He watches the footage from the entrance exam, and his stomach sinks. The kid had spent the first half of the exam running around in what looks like a blind panic, and the second half lying broken on the ground. Not exactly a quick thinker under pressure, and he hadn't gotten a single villain point. Not one. But the judges had admitted him to UA regardless, and in 7th place, no less. He doesn't care how many rescue points the kid had scored, or how he'd scored them. All he cares about is that during that test, he hadn't seen a shred of aptitude. All he'd seen was blind stupidity and reckless self-destruction, and a quirk that he hadn't bothered to train. Cocky is his first impression of Midoriya Izuku. So cocky that he hadn't even thought that he needed to hone his body or his quirk in preparation for the exam. And it infuriates him, the fact that Midoriya thinks he can skate by as a hero if he breaks himself after throwing a single punch. He would be a liability in the field. He would get himself killed. He would get other people killed. Other good heroes who had worked hard to get to where they were, and who didn't deserve to die just because some stupid kid had thought he was too good for training. It's a shame, but there's one or two in every class. He never ends the year with 20 students, but it's been a while since he had to expel someone on the first day. He meets his class, and his opinion shifts. He fully intends to expel Midoriya, but he knows from experience that he has to have a reason other than, I have a gut feeling that he's not cut out to be a hero. Thus, the quirk assessment test begins. Midoriya isn't what he expected. The kid is nervous. He jumps when Uraraka pats him on the shoulder, and he smiles shakily when Ida offers unnecessarily loud words of encouragement during the long jump. He looks downright terrified as he flounders his way through every test. And the thing is, Shouta could chalk it up to the kid realizing that he's not as good as he thought he was, that he should have been training his quirk up until now, but his gut tells him that something else is going on here. His conclusion is this: whatever cockiness he'd perceived from the results of the entrance exam, he'd clearly been mistaken. It puzzles him, though. If the kid is so jumpy, so terrified of failure, why hasn't he trained his quirk? The enigma isn't enough to convince him not to expel him, regardless of Midoriya's determination to become a hero. He can't work with a quirk that breaks his body, and Shouta has no confidence that he'll ever be able to get control of it. Letting him go on would be cruel, for more reasons than one. No matter what the motivation, it's not right to let a 15-year-old kid break his body over and over again. Except, then the ball toss happens. The final test of the day, and Shouta already has words of expulsion on his lips as he crosses his arms and returns the kid's impractical quirk so that he can either shatter himself or give up. Midoriya does not give up, and does not shatter himself. He pulls his arm back, expression settling into calculating determination, and he throws the ball so far and so fast that Shouta can't track it with his eyes alone. And that's the moment. Midoriya Izuku looks at him, eyes bright with pain but still smiling, fingers curled loosely around an aching fist, and though he's visibly shaking, he declares, "I'm still standing." That moment, Midoriya stops being a problem and starts being his problem. So he doesn't expel the kid, obviously. He calls the test a logical deception, watches the way the kid slumps with bone-deep relief, and calls it a day. He then proceeds to bang his head against the desk when he receives the report from the next day's combat training and reads that Midoriya had shattered his entire arm just to win a pointless training exercise. It's a double-edged sword, because the kid is clearly taking every bit of his training seriously, showing that he wants to improve, but he's also an idiot. The rest of the class isn't much better. Over the first few weeks of the semester, he picks up on the class's problems rather quickly. Yaoyorozu lacks confidence, Ida is too tense, Kaminari has a tendency to act brashly and fry his brain as a result. Ashido is so overeager and peppy that she often fails to really think through a situation until she's already jumped into it head first. Koda is shy to a fault. Shinso is unapproachable at the best of times. Kirishima is so chivalrous that it's almost a liability. All of these problems can be solved, and Shouta puts his mind to doing just that. It's easy enough to deal with something like Shinso's unapproachability or Yaoyorozu's insecurity under pressure. Rescue training wipes away Shinso's stiff and distant attitude. Leadership exercises show Yaoyorozu that she does know how to stand at the head of a team. With the others, too, the solutions are easy. A training exercise here, a one-on-one conversation there, and his students bloom like roses, thorns included. But then there's Midoriya. The thing is, Shouta knows how to recognize trauma. He'd spent long enough in the underground to recognize the look of soul-deep distress in a person's eyes, because he'd seen it every time he'd rescued some gaunt, sallow child from the claws of that week's human trafficking ring. He knows how to pick up on the signs, perhaps better than any of his peers. He's the only one of them that's seen the grimy underbelly of hero society and rolled in it. So he knows. After the first day of school, Shouta had reasoned that Midoriya would probably be a huge problem, and he'd been right. But he hadn't anticipated this. Midoriya is jumpy. He'd figured this out rather quickly and thought nothing of it. Plenty of kids are jumpy just for the sake of being jumpy, not because they have some kind of dark, veiled past. But Midoriya flinches like there's something to flinch away from. Something serious. And he curls in on himself like he has something to protect. Midoriya doesn't like it when people touch him. Not in the normal way, where a student might shrug off their friend's touch with an embarrassed laugh and a request for them to keep their hands to themselves. Instead, Uraraka touches the back of Midoriya's neck and he freezes, tenses up like he's waiting for something to happen. For someone to hit him. Uraraka doesn't notice because she's young and unobservant. But Shouta notices, and he begins to watch even more closely because he recognizes the look in the kid's eyes. It's the look of someone who has stood toe-to-toe with the world and lost. Midoriya doesn't trust teachers. He trembles when Shouta calls on him in class, and he looks downright terrified when he gets an answer wrong. It's like he expects to die every time he makes a mistake. Shouta tries to pull him aside once to get a better feel for why he seems so distressed, but all he gets out of the conversation is a headache. Midoriya stares at him with wide eyes and pursed lips and absolutely refuses to say anything that he thinks Shouta won't want to hear. Midoriya is sensitive to all manner of noises. He jumps when the door shuts too loudly, or when his classmates raise their voices, in anger or excitement. When Ida slips and drops one of his books off the edge of his desk one day, echoing in the silent classroom with a bang, Midoriya falls out of his chair in instinctual fright. He blushes furiously as he gets back up, assuring his friends that he's okay, but he still rubs subconsciously at the base of his throat, his chest, like he always does, whenever he perceives any sort of danger. Like he's been hurt there before, and often, and he feels like he needs to protect himself. There's something in Midoriya's eyes that burns, something dark and aching, and Shouta is terrified that he might recognize it. But he doesn't assume. He won't assume anything. When Bakugo Katsuki enters the picture, things get even more complicated. It takes him a while to figure it out, for a number of reasons. One is that Midoriya is just so obvious, shaking and flinching and curling in on himself at every turn, that Shouta doesn't even consider that he might not be the only serious trauma case in his classroom this year. Another is that, for the longest time, Shouta just thinks that Bakugo is an arrogant gremlin with an anger problem. He's always screaming, always snapping at someone or punching something or letting his palms crackle with explosions. Every time someone tries to get close, they're met with singed clothing and a fist in their gut, if they're lucky. And because Shouta doesn't directly oversee combat training, which is where the majority of all of it happens, it takes him a few weeks to realize what's happening. Once he notices, though, he can't stop noticing. Bakugo is loud and angry and, above all else, confident. He always knows what to do. He always wins. He's never afraid. He comes in first in the entrance exam, and though he slipped slightly in the rankings after their first quirk assessment test, he's such a vicious and bloodthirsty person that no one dares get close to him. He never, not one single time, doubts that he's the best. That's what it probably looks like to the class, at least. From where Shouta is standing, things are a bit different. Bakugo is not confident. Or no, he is, but he's not nearly as confident as he appears. He knows how to act confident, and he does have good critical thinking skills under pressure, which is probably what has all of his classmates fooled. But Shouta has been doing this for a long, long time. And when he looks just a bit harder at Lord Explosion Murder, as he proudly declares himself, he sees it. His incessant tenseness. The frantic flick of his eyes whenever he thinks an exit might be blocked. His fear. He paces back and forth like a caged animal, eyes wild and fierce, and Shouta can't quite pin down what's wrong with him, just that it's probably a collection of everything that has ever happened to him. Midoriya is the main outlet for whatever dark beast lurks in his past. Bakugo gravitates to Midoriya like a moth to a flame, swatting at him like he's a particularly annoying and insignificant fly on the wall. He's cruel, grabbing Midoriya wherever he can and crackling his palms with explosions, taking endless satisfaction in antagonizing him. He's there at every turn, kicking at him during class, screaming at him in the lunchroom, beating him so mercilessly during their first combat training that he sends him to the infirmary. And to the rest of the class, this, too, must look simple, like there's nothing else beneath the surface, like Bakugo just hates Midoriya, and Midoriya fears him in return, and that's all there is to it. That is not all there is to it. Bakugo trembles when he yells at Midoriya, and not out of fury. It's subtle. Shouta doubts anyone else notices. But there are tremors in his fingers when he curls them in Midoriya's collar. And though he screams, there's fear in his voice, too. A desperate bid for control over someone he thinks can give it to him. Bakugo burns. Kirishima and Kaminari gravitate to him, and Shouta hopes that their companionship is the balm he needs against his battered soul. Hopes that they can tame him, in a sense. They can't. They calm him down a bit, that much is obvious to anyone with eyes, but Bakugo still snarls and snaps his teeth at the slightest hint of danger, still tracks every exit, every room as if he thinks he might need an escape route, and he guards his vital points during combat training like he'll die if he doesn't. One day, Asui wraps her tongue around his neck. Accidentally, she'd been aiming for his chest, but he'd moved, and Shouta has to step in before Bakugo literally kills her. He's breathing harsh and desperate by the time Shouta returns his quirk, choking, like the light grip had stolen the breath from his lungs, and he gasps. He refuses to look Shouta in the eyes for days afterwards. Instead, he acts angrier than ever, like being absolutely horrible to his classmates will make up for his panic attack. Because that's what it had been, even if he refuses to admit it. He can't figure it out. Two traumatized children, both of whom gravitate to each other as if they'll wither into nothing if they don't keep fighting. Where does Bakugo fit into the puzzle? Where does Midoriya? He's not sure what to do with them, not immediately. He thinks that if it was just Midoriya, or just Bakugo, he'd stand a chance. He could think of exercises to make Midoriya feel safe, or he could do something to help Bakugo start trusting and opening up to his peers. But the two of them together are a disaster. They're a disaster, and all of Class 1A is standing in the blast zone. He's not sure why they insist upon interacting with each other, seeing as there's obviously such awful tension between them. It's clear that whenever they're around each other, they bring out the worst of each other's trauma. But they just won't stop. They circle around each other like sharks. Shouta can't tell if they're terrified of each other or if they hate each other, and he's not even sure if they can tell either. Whichever one it is, they handle their emotions very differently. Bakugo rages, Midoriya shies away, and the two of them implode whenever they see each other, drawing each other into a black hole of screaming and crying and fire. The rest of the class is roped into it because of course they are. It's funny and strange watching the two camps form. Before the end of the second week, the class has been divided up into Midoriya's friends and Bakugo's friends. And despite Bakugo's standoffish personality, the two are evenly split. Shouta is just glad that the two sides don't adopt the personalities of their unwitting leaders, and that they all seem to get along rather well with the exception of Midoriya and Bakugo themselves. Otherwise, he'd have a serious problem on his hands. Not that he doesn't already have a serious problem, because Bakugo screams, hands crackling with explosions, and Midoriya curls in on himself and shakes, and he knows that something is very wrong here. He doesn't have time to figure it out, though. The USJ happens, and everything goes to hell. The class's mood is somber after. Midoriya is out, having snapped a few bones in the attack, something that Shouta fully intends to scold him for when he returns, and no one seems to know what to do with him missing. Bakugo seems more irritable than ever, like Midoriya's well-being and his anger are connected by a thread, and the puzzle only gets more and more complicated when Shouta wonders what that might mean. Midoriya returns to class the next week, and things only escalate from there. A sports festival happens, and Midoriya breaks half the bones in his body, several of them beyond repair. Shouta sits in the commentator's booth and wonders why. Bakugo yells and fights and shakes Todoroki's slack body by the collar like he's committed some grave offense by being unconscious, screaming something about Midoriya and your declaration of war was for the wrong person, and Shouta feels like there's something here that he's not quite seeing. Todoroki migrates to Midoriya's friend group after the festival, and Shouta can't help but think that some kind of decisive victory has been won, though he's not sure by who. He keeps watching. Not acting, not yet. He's still not quite sure where the tension between the two is coming from, and he doesn't want to make a delicate situation downright volatile. They go off to their internships. Midoriya fights the hero killer and wins. When he comes back, he jumps and flies, like it's something he's always been able to do, and Bakugo watches him with clenched fists and gritted teeth. Midoriya finishes the training race in dead last and shakes like he's dying, turning a distrustful eye on Shouta when he tries to counsel him, because he's improved, but he doesn't seem to believe it. He's too fixated on his failures, and on dodging Bakugo when he comes at him screaming. By the time final exams come around, Shouta knows he needs to do something. The two are volatile. He'd been stupid to think they weren't. They've only been getting worse since the sports festival, with Bakugo actively antagonizing Midoriya whenever he gets the chance, no matter how badly he trembles in the process. Shouta had tried ignoring the problem, and it hadn't worked. Now he has to try intervention. He partners Midoriya and Bakugo up for the final exam, but Nezu is the one that puts them up against All Might. At the time, it sounds like a good idea. They'll either be forced to work together or fail the final, and since both are good students, they'll surely work together. Even if all their problems don't evaporate over the course of one exam, they'll at least begin to see that they don't have to be enemies. Apparently, Shouta has overestimated their ability to cooperate, or more depressingly, he'd underestimated whatever trauma lingers between them. He watches the exam from the teacher's private screening room, having just finished up his fight against Yaoyorozu and Todoroki. Although he hadn't expected the exam to go smoothly, the moment Bakugo whirls around and punches Midoriya in the face is a bit of a shock. After the exam, he's not sure if he made things better or worse. The two had worked together, which he counts as a win, but Bakugo had also attacked Midoriya, which is not good, and apparently it's going to take more than an exam to crack the wall between them. The training camp, he decides. He'll work on them during the training camp. Except the training camp is attacked by villains. Bakugo vanishes in a swirl of purple, Midoriya screaming for him, and that plan is thrown out the window. And really, at this point, this is getting ridiculous. Midoriya must put out some kind of telepathic signal that attracts every villain in Japan to him like a moth to a flame, or maybe Bakugo does, because these kids are making him go gray. He finds Midoriya on the ground, barely conscious and babbling. His injuries are so severe that Shouta can't believe he's still conscious. Uraraka is clinging to him in terror, Todoroki gripping his hand so hard that it must be shifting the broken bones beneath the skin. And a few of his other classmates are hovering nervously in the periphery. And, well, Shouta has learned how to deal with nightmares and flashbacks by now, but this sight will haunt him long after Midoriya has seen the last of Yue. It's a miracle he survives. He's in and out of consciousness for days, racked with seizures. And though Shouta has taken to calling both Midoriya and Bakugo his problem children, this is the moment that Midoriya takes precedent. Because he's going to kill himself. Midoriya is going to kill himself, and it will be Shota's fault for not trying harder to help him. And then, because Midoriya is stupid, he goes and sneaks himself out of the hospital and rescues Bakugo from the League of Villains. It's at this point that Shouta seriously considers expelling him. He doesn't. Of course he doesn't. But he berates him harshly, rips into him for being so ridiculously brainless, and he's so furious that he can't stop himself, even with Midoriya standing stiff, hands curled into fists at his side. He looks absolutely terrified because the teacher is angry at him, and he doesn't trust teachers. Problem child, Shouta calls him out loud for the first time. And Midoriya stops, cocks his head, looking at him like he said something particularly puzzling. It's the first time Midoriya looks at him like a teacher instead of an obstacle. It doesn't make a difference, though. When Bakugo comes back to UA after the incident, he's worse than ever, and Midoriya meets fire with fire. They fight. Late one night, they sneak out to one of the training fields and beat each other until they're black and blue and gasping. They sit in front of him when it's over. Midoriya is trembling, fingers curled in his gym shorts, head ducked to his chest, like avoiding eye contact will protect him from whatever ill intent he perceives from the other side of the desk. Bakugo is seething. He meets Shota's eyes, but he's shaking just as badly as Midoriya. This is the moment. There are two paths diverging before him, one which begs him to just ignore this and let come what will, and another that tells him, you can't let them kill each other. You certainly can't let them kill themselves. And even though it's not the easy choice, it's the right one. House arrest, he snaps at them, and watches the way Midoriya flinches, the way Bakugo leers. Midoriya, 3 days. Bakugo, 4. Monday afternoon you will both meet me back here for further disciplinary action. The two of them stare at him with wide eyes. They're still shaking. But this is not a punishment. This is an olive branch, one last, desperate attempt to mend the rips they'd forged in each other's skin. And they take it, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. Yes, Aizawa-sensei, they mutter in unison. And that's that. Things are about to change. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 1 of Fellow Feeling. Chapter 2 will be up next. Personally, I'm a big fan of this fic. I love the first chapter, especially because it really dictates all of those key events within the first year of UA, that at least leading up to Ground Beta, where you get a whole different perspective on it from Aizawa's eyes and what the author's trying to convey here. So I think they do an incredible job of writing this one out, and I got so hooked in when I first read this with the first chapter, so I'm eager to hear what your thoughts and reactions were as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening.